Someone was trying to unlock my front door, with a keyring big enough to start a car dealership. I heard this slow, deliberate clicking, like someone testing every possible key on Earth, and peeked through the blinds. There she was, hunched over the lock, muttering like the door had personally offended her. It wasn't panic, it was confidence, like she lived here and forgot which key matched which victim. At first I thought maybe she was lost. Then I realized, oh no, this lady thinks she has the right to be here. Ever seen something this bizarre? Comment below. What would you do if someone tried to professionally break into your home? The woman was wearing one of those perfectly pressed polo shirts that screamed, "I'm important in my neighborhood," and her hair was pulled back in that tight bun that said, "I demand to speak to your manager." I recognized her immediately. Lily Baxter, the self-appointed queen of our little corner of suburban Texas. She'd moved in about 8 months ago and immediately started acting like she owned the whole neighborhood. But here's the thing that really got my attention. She was trying to unlock my front door with keys that definitely weren't mine. I'd lived in this ranch house for 5 years, bought it with my own money after I retired early from my plumbing business following a back injury. I knew exactly who had keys to my house, and this lady wasn't on that very short list. I watched her for probably 3 or 4 minutes, just fascinated by the whole scene. She'd try a key, jiggle it around, curse under her breath, then move on to the next one. The morning sun was beating down on her, and I could see sweat starting to form on her forehead. She was completely absorbed in her task, occasionally glancing around to make sure nobody was watching, which, ironically, made it even more obvious that she was up to something she shouldn't be doing. Every few seconds, she'd shake her head and mutter something I couldn't quite hear through the door. Her body language screamed frustration and determination in equal measure. What made this whole situation even more interesting was that my son Mike was sitting right there in my kitchen, eating a bowl of cereal and reading something on his phone. Mike's 26 years old, a deputy sheriff for our county, and he'd been staying with me for the past week while his apartment was getting some work done. He was technically on vacation, so he was just wearing regular clothes, jeans, and a plain t-shirt. But I could see his cop instincts starting to kick in. He'd noticed the sounds too and was listening carefully, his head tilted slightly toward the front door. When I turned around and caught his eye, he raised his eyebrows in a silent question. I pointed toward the window and mouthed, "Come look at this." Mike set down his spoon and walked over to where I was standing. When he saw Lily hunched over our door with her massive key collection, his expression shifted from curious to professional real quick. We both watched for another minute as she continued her futile attempts to find the magic key that would somehow grant her access to my home. That's when I decided I'd seen enough of this little show. I walked calmly to my front door, turned the deadbolt from the inside, and opened it wide. "Can I help you with something?" I asked in the most pleasant tone I could manage. The look on her face when she realized she'd been caught red-handed was absolutely priceless. Pure shock mixed with embarrassment, followed immediately by that defensive anger that some people get when they know they're in the wrong but refuse to admit it. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she stammered, jumping back from the door like it had suddenly caught fire. I'm conducting mandatory safety inspections for the HOA." She straightened up and tried to regain her composure, clutching that enormous key ring like it was some kind of badge of authority. "All residents are required to allow access for these quarterly safety checks. It's in the neighborhood covenant." She said this with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd practiced this speech, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes. The way she was gripping those keys so tightly that her knuckles were turning white told me everything I needed to know about how legitimate this inspection really was. "Safety inspection, huh?" I replied, leaning against my door frame and crossing my arms. "And you were planning to conduct this inspection with someone else's keys?" I gestured toward the key ring that was still clutched in her death grip. "Because I'm pretty sure those aren't mine, and I definitely don't remember giving anyone permission to enter my home when I'm not around." The look that crossed her face was like watching someone realize they'd just stepped in quicksand. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Behind me, I could hear Mike setting down his coffee cup and moving closer to the door, though he stayed out of sight. Lily's recovery was swift, I'll give her that. Within seconds, she'd shifted from embarrassed to indignant. "Mr. Carter, every responsible homeowner in this neighborhood has provided spare keys for emergency situations and safety compliance. I'm the HOA president, and I have the legal authority to ensure that all properties meet our community standards. She waved that key ring at me like it was Excalibur or something. If you refuse to cooperate with mandatory inspections, you'll be in violation of multiple neighborhood regulations and will have no choice but to pursue legal action. The transformation was remarkable. She'd gone from caught burglar to righteous authority figure in the span of about 10 seconds. As I closed the door and leaned against it, something nagged at the back of my mind. About 2 weeks ago, I'd noticed Lily walking slowly around my garage, clipboard in hand, claiming she was checking for water main issues in the neighborhood. At the time, I'd thought it was just neighborly concern, maybe even appreciated her attention to community infrastructure. Now, thinking back on how she'd lingered by my windows and tested my gate latch, I realized she'd been casing my property all along. This wasn't some sudden power trip. This woman had been planning her move against me for weeks. 2 hours later, I was enjoying a peaceful cup of coffee on my back porch when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the screen door, I could see Lily marching up my front walkway like she was leading a military parade. This time, she was carrying a clipboard and what looked like a thick folder of papers. Her previous embarrassment had apparently been replaced by pure determination. I called out to Mike, who was in the living room. "Hey son, looks like our friend is back for round 2. He appeared beside me immediately, and we both watched through the screen as Lily positioned herself on my front porch and knocked on the door with the kind of aggressive authority that suggested she meant business this time. When I opened the door, she didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Mr. Carter, I have here official documentation of multiple violations occurring on your property." She held up the clipboard like she was serving me a legal summons. "After conducting a thorough exterior inspection this morning, I've identified 8 separate infractions of our neighborhood standards. You have 24 hours to begin remediation, or you'll face fines totaling $2,500. She flipped through the papers with practiced efficiency, pointing out various items that apparently constituted crimes against suburban harmony. Your mailbox is the wrong shade of black, your fence height exceeds the maximum allowance by 3 inches, and your garden contains unauthorized plantings that don't appear on the approved vegetation list. I took the papers from her and glanced through them, trying not to laugh at the ridiculous level of detail she'd put into this nonsense. Every alleged violation had been photographed, measured, and documented like evidence in a murder trial. She'd even included timestamps and weather conditions for each photo. "This is very impressive work, Lily," I said, and I meant it. The level of obsession required to produce this kind of documentation was genuinely impressive, if completely insane. "Just one quick question though, Lily. Unless you can show me exactly where I signed an agreement to join your HOA, you're trespassing on private property." I handed her papers back to her. "Until I see my signature agreeing to be bound by these rules, I'm afraid you're just harassing a private citizen." The question seemed to catch her off guard for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "That's irrelevant, Mr. Carter. When property values are at stake, community standards apply to everyone in the neighborhood, regardless of when they purchased their homes." Her voice was getting louder and more aggressive with each sentence. Then she did something I wasn't expecting. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of me standing in my own doorway. "I'm documenting your refusal to cooperate," she announced, clicking away like some kind of paparazzi. "This behavior will be included in my report to the county officials." After Lily left with her dramatic threats about returning with proper authorities, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. What I discovered during that walk was far more disturbing than Lily's ridiculous violation reports. 3 houses down, I found my neighbor Henry working in his front garden, but something was wrong. Henry was 72 years old, a widower who'd been tending the most beautiful tulip garden I'd ever seen, a garden his late wife had planted 20 years ago. Now he was pulling up the tulips with tears in his eyes. "Henry, what are you doing?" I asked, genuinely shocked to see him destroying his wife's memorial garden. He looked up at me with the most defeated expression I'd ever seen. "Lily told me I had to remove all the tulips because they're not on the approved native plant list," he said, his voice shaking. "She said if I didn't comply within 48 hours, the HOA would fine me $500 and hire landscapers to remove them at my expense. I thought she was real authority, Mason. She had all these official papers and everything." The sight of this gentle old man destroying his wife's legacy because of Lily's fake authority made my blood boil in a way I hadn't felt since my military days. As I continued my walk, I stopped by the house of Sarah, a single mother of 2 who worked double shifts as a nurse. She was installing a security camera system on her front porch, which seemed odd since our neighborhood was generally very safe. "New security upgrade?" I asked. Lily told me it was mandatory for all single-parent households to install cameras as part of the HOA patrol system, Sarah explained, struggling with the mounting hardware. He said it was for neighborhood watch coordination and that I'd be fined if I didn't comply within the week. The cameras cost me $400. I really couldn't afford, but I can't risk getting kicked out of the neighborhood. The pattern was becoming clear. Lily wasn't just targeting me. She was systematically manipulating vulnerable residents throughout our community. By the time I got back to my house, I had talked to 6 different neighbors, and every single one had a story about Lily's requirements and mandatory compliance. She'd convinced an elderly couple to repaint their entire house because the current color wasn't on her approved palette. She'd forced a young family to remove a swing set from their backyard because it violated sightline regulations. Most disturbing of all, she'd convinced several residents to hand over spare keys under various pretenses: emergency access, safety inspections, insurance requirements. This woman had built an entire empire of control based on nothing but intimidation and official-looking paperwork. When I told Mike what I'd discovered, his expression shifted from concern to professional alarm. "Dad, this isn't just harassment anymore. This is systematic fraud targeting vulnerable populations. She's running a full-scale con operation on our entire neighborhood." He pulled out his phone and started taking notes as I recounted each story. "We need to document all of this before she escalates further. People like Lily don't stop when they're challenged. They double down." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Henry, calling to tell me that Lily had just visited him again, asking detailed questions about my daily routine and whether I lived alone. As soon as Lily's car disappeared around the corner, Mike emerged from the living room with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Dad, we need to talk about this situation," he said, settling into one of the chairs on my back porch. "That woman just committed several crimes, and she's clearly not done escalating this thing." He pulled out his phone and showed me the voice recording app he'd been running. I got most of that conversation on audio, including her threats about legal action and her admission about conducting unauthorized property inspections. His cop training was really showing now, methodical, evidence-finkered, and already thinking 3 steps ahead. We spent the next hour going through everything that had happened, with Mike asking detailed questions about my property purchase, any HOA documents I might have received, and the timeline of Lily's behavior in the neighborhood. "Here's what I think is happening," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "This woman has convinced herself that she has authority she doesn't actually possess, and she's been using intimidation tactics to bully neighbors into compliance. The key thing, no pun intended, is that collection of keys she was using." He pulled up something on his phone. "Dad, it's illegal to possess unauthorized copies of someone else's keys. That's manufacturing burglary tools, and it's a serious felony." As we sat there planning our response, Mike looked at me with curiosity. "Dad, I've got to ask, why do you hate HOAs so much? I mean, I get that this Lily situation is crazy, but you seemed pretty fired up about the whole concept even before she started harassing you." I set down my coffee cup and was quiet for a moment, remembering something I rarely talked about. "Son, your mother and I had a run-in with an HOA back in Florida, years before you were born. We bought this little house near the coast, and the HOA there was run by people just like Lily, control freaks who thought they owned everyone else's property. Your mother stressed herself sick over those people, Mason," I continued, feeling the old anger stirring again. "Constant violation notices, arbitrary fines, threats about our garden. She'd lose sleep worrying about what new rule they'd invented to harass us with." Mike was listening intently, understanding for the first time why this situation was so personal for me. "Mom ended up in the hospital with stress heart problems," I said, my voice getting quieter. "The doctors said the constant anxiety had triggered a cardiac episode. She never fully recovered from that, Mike. We moved away from that place, but the damage was done." Mike reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "I never knew it was that bad, Dad. No wonder you're not backing down from this Lily character." "That's why I moved out here after your mom passed," I explained. "I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody could tell me what color to paint my mailbox or what flowers I could plant. I bought this place specifically because there was no HOA, no neighborhood association, no busybody telling me how to live on my own property." Mike nodded, understanding now why this wasn't just about property rights for me. It was about protecting the peaceful life I'd built in memory of my wife. "Well, Dad, if this woman thinks she can bully you the way that Florida HOA bullied Mom, she's got another thing coming. We're going to document everything and stop her before she hurts anyone else the way they hurt our family." We decided that the best approach was to document everything and prepare for her promised return with proper authorities. Mike set up his phone to record any future conversations, and we made sure all our doors and windows were properly secured. "The thing is, Dad, she's not going to back down easily," Mike warned. "People like this, when they get challenged, they tend to escalate rather than retreat. She's probably going to come back with even more aggressive tactics." He was right, of course. We were dealing with someone who'd built her entire identity around being the neighborhood enforcer, and admitting she was wrong would mean admitting her whole power structure was a lie. "You know what, though?" Mike said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. "By tomorrow, you're probably going to be the most famous guy in the neighborhood. Either the hero who stood up to the HOA tyrant, or the rebel who refused to follow community standards." I couldn't help but laugh at that. "Son, at my age, a little notoriety might be exactly what I need. Your mother always said I was too quiet for my own good." It felt good to laugh together, even in the middle of this stressful situation. The bond between us had grown stronger through this crisis, and I was grateful to have his support and expertise on my side. That evening, around 6 o'clock, my phone started ringing. The first call was from the elderly neighbor next door again, sounding worried. "Mason, Lily stopped by this afternoon asking questions about you. She wanted to know about your work schedule, whether you lived alone, if you had any family visiting." The second call came from another neighbor with a similar report. "She's been going door to door telling people that you're dangerous and uncooperative, that you threatened her when she was just trying to do her job." By the time the third neighbor called with basically the same story, it was clear that Lily was conducting some kind of campaign to isolate me and build support for whatever she was planning next. Mike listened to each phone call with increasing concern. "Dad, she's building a narrative," he said when the calls finally stopped. "She's telling everyone that you're the problem, that you're threatening and dangerous. She's setting up justification for whatever extreme measure she's planning to take tomorrow." He looked at me seriously. "When someone starts spreading stories about you being dangerous, it usually means they're planning to call law enforcement and claim they feel threatened. That gives them an excuse to escalate the situation and potentially get you arrested based on false accusations." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She was probably planning to call the police on a house where a deputy sheriff was sitting right there in the kitchen. The next morning started quietly enough, but around 10:30 I spotted Lily's car creeping slowly down our street. She parked about 3 houses down and sat there for probably 20 minutes, just watching my house like she was conducting some kind of surveillance operation. Mike and I were both keeping an eye on her from different windows, and it was pretty obvious that she was working up the courage for whatever she had planned. Finally, she got out of her car and approached my property, but this time she didn't come to the front door. Instead, she walked around to the side of the house and started testing the windows. What made this approach even more disturbing was what she was carrying. Along with her usual clipboard and keyring, she now had what appeared to be an official-looking document in a plastic sleeve. I watched in amazement as this woman systematically tried every window on the ground floor, pulling out different keys from her collection and attempting to find some way into my house. She spent at least 10 minutes on each window, trying multiple keys and even attempting to force locks that clearly weren't designed to be opened from the outside. But the most unsettling part was watching her periodically consult an official-looking document in a plastic sleeve. When Mike zoomed in with his phone camera, we could see it was a poorly forged property access authorization form with a Microsoft Word clip art logo of a tree and stars that no real government agency would ever use. "This is incredible," Mike whispered, watching Lily move from the side windows to the back of the house. "She's completely lost touch with reality. She actually thinks those keys are going to work on your house." We could hear her talking to herself as she worked, muttering things like, "These should work," and "everyone else cooperated." It was like watching someone have a conversation with their own delusions. He tried the back door, the basement windows, even the garage side door. Every failure seemed to make her more frustrated and more determined rather than helping her realize that maybe she didn't actually have the authority she claimed. The most disturbing part was listening to her rationalize her behavior out loud, especially when she started sniffing around my basement windows. "Property values depend on compliance," she kept saying to herself. "Everyone has to follow the same rules." At one point, she actually got down on her hands and knees and sniffed near a basement window, then made notes on her clipboard. "Smells like weed killer down here," she muttered, "probably not following proper chemical application guidelines. That's a health code violation." The fact that she was analyzing the smell of my lawn care products through my basement windows crossed a line from eccentric behavior into genuinely creepy stalking territory. After about 45 minutes of watching this woman attempt to break into my house from every possible angle, while simultaneously conducting some kind of bizarre environmental inspection, Mike and I realized she wasn't going to give up voluntarily. She was completely committed to this insane mission, and she was going to keep escalating until something stopped her. "Dad, I think we're about to see her nuclear option," Mike said, watching Lily walk back to her car with obvious frustration. "She's failed at intimidation, she's failed at legal threats, and she's failed at actually breaking in. The next step for someone like this is usually to call law enforcement and claim they're the victim." What made her behavior even more alarming was the systematic way she documented everything. She wasn't just trying random windows. She was photographing each attempt, measuring distances, and taking notes about everything from my landscaping to the condition of my gutters. "Look at this," Mike said, reviewing the footage he'd captured. "She's building some kind of case file, like she's gathering evidence for a prosecution. This woman has completely convinced herself that she's conducting a legitimate investigation." Sure enough, we watched through the window as Lily sat in her car for a few minutes, clearly working herself up for something. She kept looking at my house, then at her phone, then back at my house. She pulled out that fake authorization document several times, reading it like it would give her courage for whatever she was planning. Finally, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. Even from inside my house, I could hear her voice getting louder and more agitated as she talked. We couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was reporting some kind of emergency or threat. Mike looked at me with a mix of professional concern and family protectiveness. "Here we go," he said. "She's calling 911. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. This woman was about to call the police to report a dangerous man who had threatened her and refused to cooperate with lawful authority. She had no idea that the dangerous man she was reporting was actually a disabled veteran who just wanted to live quietly, and that his son, a deputy sheriff, was sitting right there in the kitchen, finishing his morning coffee. We could see her in her car, gesticulating wildly as she talked to the emergency dispatcher, probably describing me as some kind of menace to community safety while waving around her fake authorization document as proof of her legitimate authority. Little did she know that her entire narrative was about to collapse in the most spectacular way possible. From our position at the kitchen window, Mike and I could see Lily in her car talking animatedly on her phone. Her free hand was waving around as she spoke, and even though we couldn't hear the specific words, her body language made it clear that she was painting quite the dramatic picture for whoever was on the other end of that call. Mike had changed into a clean button-down shirt, still civilian clothes, but something that would look more professional if needed. "Dad, when the officers arrive, let me handle the initial contact," he said. "I want to make sure this is done completely by the book." We didn't have to wait long. Within about 8 minutes, we heard sirens in the distance getting closer. Lily immediately got out of her car and positioned herself on the sidewalk, pointing dramatically toward my house like she was directing an assault on a dangerous criminal stronghold. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and 4 officers got out. I recognized one of them immediately, an officer who Mike had introduced me to at a barbecue last summer. The irony was getting thicker by the minute. Lily rushed over to the officers, talking rapidly and gesturing toward my house with obvious urgency. Through the window, we could see her giving what appeared to be a detailed briefing about the threat I supposedly posed. She was pointing at different parts of my property, probably describing all the violations she'd documented, and occasionally pointing directly at my front door. The officers were listening politely, but I could see them exchanging glances that suggested they were already skeptical of her story. One of them was taking notes, while another was looking at my house with the kind of professional assessment that comes from years of responding to domestic calls. "Showtime," Mike said quietly, straightening his shirt. He walked calmly to the front door and opened it before the officers even had a chance to knock. The look on Lily's face when she saw him was absolutely priceless. Complete shock, followed by confusion, followed by what looked like dawning horror as she started to realize that something was very wrong with her carefully constructed narrative. "Good morning, officers," Mike said in his most professional voice. "I'm Deputy Mike Carter, badge number 4729. I believe you're here about a complaint involving my father." The lead officer's face broke into a surprised smile. "Mike, what are you doing here?" The other officers looked confused, glancing between Mike and Lily, who was standing there with her mouth hanging open like someone had just told her the earth was flat. "This is my dad's house," Mike explained calmly. "I'm on vacation this week, staying here while my apartment gets some work done." I understand there's been some kind of complaint filed." He gestured toward Lily, who was still staring at him like he'd just materialized out of thin air. "Wait, this is impossible." Lily finally found her voice, though it came out shrill and panicked. "Your father is dangerous. He threatened me. He's been violating neighborhood regulations and refusing to cooperate with lawful authority." She was looking back and forth between Mike and the other officers like she was waiting for someone to tell her this was all a big joke. "You can't just ignore a legitimate complaint because you know him." Mike maintained his professional composure perfectly. "Ma'am, I'd like to hear about these threats you mentioned. When exactly did my father threaten you, and what specifically did he say?" His tone was courteous, but official, the voice of someone who spent years taking statements from agitated citizens. "Also, I'm curious about your authority to conduct property inspections and your possession of what appears to be keys to multiple residences in this neighborhood." The other officers were now paying very close attention, and I could see them starting to reassess the situation based on Mike's questions. Lily's story started falling apart immediately under professional questioning. When pressed for specifics about these threats, she couldn't provide any actual threatening language, just vague claims about intimidating behavior and refusing to cooperate. When asked about her authority to inspect properties, she waved around her homemade documentation and talked about community standards without being able to cite any actual legal framework. And when the lead officer asked to see her collection of keys, her face went pale. Those are for emergency purposes," she stammered. "Neighbors provided them voluntarily for safety reasons." "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see those keys," the officer said, his tone shifting from casual to official. "Unauthorized possession of keys to someone else's property is a serious crime, and we've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood." As Lily reluctantly handed over her enormous keyring, the officers examined it with obvious concern. There had to be at least 20 keys on that ring, clearly representing multiple different properties. "Can you provide documentation showing that each of these keys was given to you with proper authorization?" the officer asked. "And can you explain why you were attempting to use them to enter Mr. Carter's residence without his permission?" The sight of Mike in civilian clothes, clearly comfortable in my house and obviously my son, had completely shattered Lily's narrative about the dangerous, threatening homeowner who needed to be stopped by law enforcement. But she wasn't ready to give up. "Officers, I don't care who his son is," she said, her voice getting more desperate with each word. "I have documented evidence of multiple violations of neighborhood standards, and this man has refused to cooperate with mandatory safety inspections. Community property values are at stake here." She was still waving her clipboard around like it contained some kind of legal authority that would trump the presence of an actual law enforcement officer. The lead officer was examining the key ring with growing concern. "Ma'am, I count 23 different keys here. That's a lot of emergency access for one person to be responsible for." He looked up at Mike. "Deputy Carter, has your father reported any attempted break-ins or suspicious activity?" Mike nodded and pulled out his phone. "Actually, yes. I've been documenting several incidents over the past few days where this woman has attempted to gain unauthorized entry to my father's residence using various keys from that collection." He showed the officers his recorded footage of Lily trying different windows and doors. The video evidence was damning. Clear footage of Lily systematically attempting to unlock windows, trying multiple keys on doors, and even attempting to force locks that weren't designed to be opened from the outside. "Ma'am, this appears to show you attempting to break into Mr. Carter's residence," the lead officer said, his tone now completely serious. "Can you explain why you believed you had the right to enter his property without permission?" Lily's face was cycling through various shades of red as she watched herself on Mike's phone screen. "Those weren't break-in attempts. Those were legitimate safety inspections. I have the authority to ensure compliance with neighborhood standards." "And where exactly does this authority come from?" asked the second officer. "Do you have documentation showing legal jurisdiction over Mr. Carter's property?" Lily fumbled through her folder, pulling out various papers and waving them around. "I'm the HOA president. I was elected by the neighborhood. Property values depend on everyone following the same rules." But when pressed to produce actual legal documents establishing an HOA with jurisdiction over my property, she couldn't come up with anything more substantial than her homemade violation reports and some printed emails between neighbors. The more questions the officers asked, the clearer it became that Lily's entire authority structure existed only in her own mind. She'd never been officially elected to anything. She'd simply declared herself president of a homeowners association that didn't actually exist in any legal sense. The neighborhood standards she kept referencing were rules she'd made up herself and printed on official-looking letterhead, and those 23 keys she'd been carrying around represented a systematic campaign of manipulation, targeting vulnerable neighbors who trusted her claims of authority. Mike provided contact information for several neighbors who'd been approached by Lily, and another officer started making calls. The pattern that emerged was disturbing and consistent. Lily had targeted elderly residents, people recovering from illness, and new homeowners who were unsure about neighborhood procedures. She'd convinced them to hand over spare keys by claiming everything from insurance requirements to emergency preparedness to community safety protocols. Some people had given her keys months ago and had completely forgotten about it until the police called to ask. The elderly lady 4 houses down gave her a key 8 months ago when she was recovering from hip surgery, the officer reported after finishing his calls. She thought it was some kind of official neighborhood watch program. The man across the street handed over his key when he first moved in because Lily told him it was required for his homeowner's insurance to be valid. The scope of Lily's deception was becoming clear, and it was much larger than just her attempts to get into my house. She'd been systematically collecting access to people's homes for months, all under the pretense of official authority she simply didn't possess. As the officers continued their investigation, Lily seemed to realize that her situation was deteriorating rapidly. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Property values in this neighborhood have been declining because people won't maintain proper standards. Someone has to take responsibility for community appearance and safety. If everyone just does whatever they want, the whole area becomes a slum." Her genuine belief in her mission was almost touching, if it wasn't completely insane. She really thought she was saving the neighborhood from chaos and decline. What made Lily's delusion even more disturbing was when one of the officers asked her about the fake authorization document. "Ma'am, where did you get this official form?" he asked, examining the plastic sleeve. Lily's face lit up with pride. "I designed it myself using templates from the internet," she announced, as if this was something to be proud of. "I researched proper government formatting and official language. It took me weeks to get the letterhead just right." The officers exchanged incredulous looks as she essentially confessed to creating fraudulent government documents. "I even laminated it so it would look more professional during inspections," she added, completely oblivious to the fact that she was digging her legal grave deeper with every word. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the lead officer ran a background check on Lily through the system. "Ma'am, I see here that you were previously issued a restraining order in Harris County for harassment of neighbors and fraudulent claims of authority," he said, reading from his computer screen. "You were banned from acting as an HOA representative after multiple complaints about intimidation tactics and abuse of power." Lily's face went white as her history caught up with her. That was completely different. Those people didn't understand the importance of community standards. They were just as selfish and uncooperative as him. She pointed at me like I was the source of all neighborhood evil. While the officers were processing this information, Mike quietly pulled his colleague aside. "Given her prior record and the systematic nature of these crimes, you might want to request a search warrant for her residence sooner rather than later," he said in a low voice. "People like this often destroy evidence once they realize they're caught. Phones, computers, files. The sooner we can secure her property, the better our case will be." The officer nodded appreciatively. "Good thinking, Carter. I'll call it in now." It was impressive watching Mike maintain his professional boundaries, while still contributing his expertise to protect the investigation's integrity. The officers had heard enough. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for criminal trespass, attempted burglary, fraud, and filing a false police report," the lead officer announced, pulling out his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they read Lily her rights and placed her in handcuffs, she continued protesting her innocence and the importance of her mission. "You're making a huge mistake. Property values will plummet without proper oversight. The neighborhood needs leadership." Even as she was being loaded into the back of a patrol car, she was still insisting that she was the victim of a misunderstanding. Mike handled the entire situation with perfect professionalism, providing official statements and ensuring that all evidence was properly documented. The other officers were clearly impressed with how he'd managed the investigation while maintaining appropriate boundaries about family involvement. "Your son did excellent work on this case," the lead officer told me as they prepared to leave. "He documented everything properly and never overstepped his authority. This woman could have caused serious problems for a lot of people if this pattern had continued." As the patrol cars drove away with Lily in custody, something beautiful happened in our neighborhood. Word had spread quickly about the police activity, and within an hour, people started gathering on my front lawn. Not in an angry mob kind of way, but more like a community that had suddenly been freed from something they didn't even realize was oppressing them. Henry was the first to arrive, and when he saw me, he actually started crying. "Mason, I can't believe what she put us all through," he said, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "She told me if I didn't remove my wife's tulips, she'd have them destroyed by landscapers and charge me for it. I spent all night pulling up 20 years of my Margaret's work." The stories that came pouring out were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Sarah, the single mother, arrived with her 2 young kids and explained how Lily had convinced her that the security cameras were required by law. "I worked extra shifts for 2 weeks to afford those cameras," she said. "I was terrified of getting evicted if I didn't comply." One of the elderly couples from down the street revealed that Lily had actually entered their home while the husband was napping, claiming it was a routine safety inspection. "I woke up to find her in my living room, taking pictures of our furniture arrangement," the man said, still shaken by the memory. "She said our couch placement was a fire hazard." Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from a young father who'd moved in just 3 months ago. Lily told me that families with children had to install playground equipment that met specific HOA standards, he explained. "When I couldn't afford the $1,500 swing set she recommended, she said my kids weren't allowed to play in their own backyard." His 8-year-old daughter tugged on his sleeve and added, "The mean lady said I couldn't play hopscotch on the sidewalk because it made chalk marks." The idea that this woman had been terrorizing children with her made-up rules made my blood boil all over again. As more neighbors shared their experiences, a pattern of psychological manipulation became clear. Lily had targeted each person's specific vulnerabilities: the elderly with fears about safety and compliance, new residents with uncertainty about neighborhood rules, single parents with worries about providing for their children, and families with concerns about fitting into the community. She'd systematically identified what each person cared about most and then weaponized those concerns to control their behavior. It was sophisticated emotional manipulation disguised as community leadership. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Lily's operation. Police found detailed files in her house containing photographs of various properties, notes about residents' schedules, and plans for compliance enforcement that bordered on stalking. She'd been entering people's homes when they weren't there, taking pictures of anything she considered a violation, and building cases for fines and penalties that had no legal basis whatsoever. Some neighbors discovered that personal items had been moved or that their homes had been inspected without their knowledge. The violation of privacy and trust was staggering. The legal consequences were swift and appropriate. Lily was convicted on multiple counts of burglary, criminal trespass, fraud, and harassment. The judge was particularly harsh in sentencing because of the systematic nature of her crimes and her targeting of vulnerable residents. She received 18 months in jail, was ordered to pay restitution to all affected homeowners, and was banned from any future involvement in neighborhood associations or property management. Her conviction also voided any legitimate authority she might have claimed, officially dissolving her fake HOA structure. For our neighborhood, Lily's arrest was like lifting a cloud that people hadn't even realized was hanging over them. Neighbors who had been afraid to paint their shutters or plant flowers in their own gardens suddenly felt free to make their properties truly their own again. Henry immediately began replanting his wife's tulip garden, and the whole community pitched in to help him recreate Margaret's memorial garden from old photographs. Sarah was able to return the expensive security cameras and use that money for her kids' school supplies instead. The young father built a simple tire swing for his daughter, and she resumed her hopscotch games on the sidewalk with renewed joy. Mike received a commendation from the sheriff's department for his professional handling of the situation, and the case became a training example for how to investigate systematic fraud and abuse of authority claims. More importantly for me, the whole experience brought us closer together as father and son. As we sat on the porch that evening, watching our neighbors finally relax and enjoy their own properties, I put my hand on his shoulder. "Mike, you didn't just protect your old man today," I told him. "You protected this entire little community. You gave these people their peace back." He smiled and squeezed my hand. "Dad, watching you stand up to her inspired me. You showed me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight in your own backyard." The last I heard, Lily was trying to appeal her conviction on the grounds that she was just trying to help the neighborhood maintain proper standards. She apparently still doesn't understand that good intentions don't justify criminal behavior, and that real authority comes from legitimate sources, not from printing official-looking documents and intimidating your neighbors. As for me, I'm back to enjoying my peaceful retirement in my ranch house, with my original locks, my own keys, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail when good people stand up to bullies. Today, whenever I wash dishes at my kitchen sink, I sometimes glance out at my front door and remember the sight of Lily hunched over it with her ridiculous collection of fake master keys. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous people are often those who convince themselves that their personal mission justifies violating other people's rights. But it also reminds me that truth, patience, and a little bit of law enforcement training can go a long way towards setting things right when someone decides to abuse whatever power they think they have.
That's a wrap from QA Stories, but don't go far. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you on our channel.